The flight started normally with the excitement and pride of little Emma, who was only 8 years old, when she learned that her father, Captain Liam Carter, was the captain of the flight. Emma is always full of energy and excitement, especially when it comes to sitting on the flight that her father controls. While the flight was stabilizing, she picked up crayons, drew a picture of the plane and kept telling her mother, Sophia, about the interesting things her father had taught. However, her cheerfulness and clear laughter quickly attracted an unpleasant look from Sarah Jenkins, a flight attendant who had been in a bad mood since the beginning of the day. Sarah, at first, tries to suppress her emotions, but restlessness and irritability begin to manifest themselves in her gestures and words. When Emma accidentally asks for more tissues after spilling some water on the table, Sarah not only delays responding, but also shows a gruff attitude, appearing annoyed as if her small request is too much of a burden. The tension in Sarah's attitude escalated as she continued to accidentally drop her crayons, making a small noise in the cabin. At this time, Sarah almost lost control, shouting at Emma loudly, making the little girl silent, her eyes full of fear and surprise. The incident became more serious when, in an act of anger, Sarah suddenly slapped Emma on the cheek. The girl's sudden cry rang out in the quiet space of the cabin, causing all the passengers to turn around, witnessing the shocking scene. Sophia, the mother who was gentle, immediately reacted fiercely. She stood up, shielded her daughter, and loudly demanded that Sarah apologize. Sophia's face changed from stunned to angry. Her eyes lit up with fierce protection for her daughter. The atmosphere in the cabin quickly became tense. Passengers began to stir. Some voiced their support for Sophia. Others returned to the video to testify. Meanwhile, Sarah seems to realize that her actions have gone too far. She lowered her head, trying to explain that it was just a moment out of control, but no one accepted this excuse. When the situation seemed to get out of control, Captain Liam Carter, Emma's father, stepped out of the cockpit after being informed of the incident by the flight crew. His expression was silent, but he could not hide the pain when he saw his daughter trembling, her cheeks flushed and still scared in her mother's arms. In a low but authoritative voice, he asked Sarah to immediately leave the cabin, and promised the passengers that the incident would be dealt with strictly when the flight landed. At this time, the psychology of the characters is pushed to the climax. Emma snuggled into her mother's arms, tears flowing, her eyes bewildered as to why she was treated like that. Sophia was both heartbroken and angry, trying hard to reassure her, but still showing a tough attitude to Sarah. The majority of passengers felt outraged by the actions of the flight attendants, creating an underground pressure covering the cabin. For her part, Sarah clearly showed confusion and regret, but this incident made her unable to abdicate responsibility. Liam's actions are not only the responsibility of a captain but also the strong protection of a father. His presence brought some stability to the cabin, but also confirmed that this was not just a minor incident but a major emotional wound for his family, especially for Emma. The atmosphere on the flight has since become quieter, but also full of heavy emotions intertwined with anger, grief, and hope for justice. The air in the cabin becomes stifling as the tension rises by the minute. After Sarah Jenkins was rude and misbehaved with Emma, the passengers' discontent spread. Some people sitting nearby couldn't be silent any longer. They began to talk, many voices expressing outrage at the hostess's behavior. The angry eyes, the phones held up to record the incident, all made Sarah feel compelled. However, instead of apologizing, Sarah let narcissism dominate. Her face was tense, her eyes were full of unease, but her tone still tried to keep a cold look. She pushed back at criticism from nearby passengers, insisting she was only on duty and that her behavior was to ensure order during the flight. But her words not only did not ease the situation, but also made the atmosphere more tense. An elderly passenger, with a calm but sharp voice, questioned directly, "How can a child who drops a crayon deserve to be treated like that? Is this how airlines teach employees to behave?" Sophia, Emma's mother, couldn't sit still. She stood up, her eyes full of determination, facing Sarah. "You just attacked my daughter. Do you think that action can be ignored? She's just a child." Sophia's voice was not loud, but it was filled with repressed anger and the pain of a mother who witnessed her child being hurt. Meanwhile, Emma was still sitting still, snuggled into a chair. Her eyes were red, and her small body was trembling. She tried to suppress the remaining cries, her small hands clutching her mother's hand as if looking for protection. The incident escalated when another passenger, a young man, stood up and asked to meet with the captain to report the incident. "We can't sit here and let this go on. This is an act of violence." Cheers rang out, forming a wave of pressure in the cabin. The other flight attendants tried to calm the situation, but their presence at this time no longer seemed to be strong enough to calm the passengers' anger. Sarah, now completely disoriented, took a step back. Her face showed confusion and fear, but she still refused to admit her mistake. Her psychology is torn between shame and fear of consequences. Meanwhile, the air in the cabin continues to boil. The unity of the passengers, Sophia's voice of indignation, and the reproachful gaze from all over made Sarah fall into isolation. The tension was only partially eased when Captain Liam Carter left the cockpit to directly address the situation. His appearance, with his solemn appearance and sharp eyes, immediately attracted everyone's attention. He walked closer to Sarah, his voice deep but authoritative. "You need to leave the cabin immediately. I will make sure this is reported to my superiors. For passengers, this is the act of a decisive leader, and for his family, it is an affirmation that he will not let anyone hurt his daughter." Liam's presence provided temporary reassurance, but the atmosphere in the cabin was still stifling. The passengers simultaneously showed their support for Sophia's family, while Sarah walked silently, her face dull, carrying shame. Emma, though protected by her mother's arms, could not erase the fear in her eyes, a mental wound that time could hardly heal. Tension in the cabin reached its peak when passengers could no longer contain their anger at Sarah Jenkins' behavior. After being criticized by many passengers, Sarah's eyes clearly showed confusion and helplessness. She took a step back, trying to regain control but no longer seemed to be as cold as before. Her words of justification now only make passengers more angry. An elderly man sitting in a nearby row stood up, pointed directly at Sarah, and shouted, "We don't pay to see the company's employees behave like that. Don't think you have the right to abuse your power with a child." Meanwhile, Sophia, Emma's mother, can't take any longer. She stood up straight, her eyes full of anger, pointing at Sarah. "Who do you think you are that would dare to hurt my daughter? She's only 8 years old, and all she does is drop a crayon. You have no right to threaten or hurt it. Never." Sophia's voice was not loud, but full of determination and trembling, as if the words came from the depths of a wounded mother's heart. Emma, who was snuggled up in the chair next to her mother, continued to tremble. Her red eyes stared at Sarah, both scared and confused. Her hand gripped her mother's hand, as if it was the only place she could find safety. The little girl's sobbing resounded in the tense atmosphere, making many passengers even more outraged by this situation. The wave of protests exploded when a young passenger stepped forward, holding up his phone with a video recording the entire incident. "It's all back," he declared, his voice defiant. "We're going to put this online, so people know what's really going on here." That sentence was like pouring more oil on the fire, making the chaos even more. At this moment, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Liam Carter appeared. His presence immediately caused the atmosphere in the cabin to calm down a little. With a stern expression, he walked to the middle of the cabin, his eyes coldly looking directly at Sarah. "Miss Jenkins," his deep voice sounded like a powerful summons. "We need to talk right away. Please leave the cabin and leave this matter to me." Sarah, now no longer retaining her original confidence or firmness, stood still. She lowered her head, trying to hide her embarrassment, and then quietly left the cabin under the prying eyes of dozens of passengers. A few people even applauded as she walked by, as if they were celebrating the troublemaker's retreat. As things calmed down, Sophia turned to Emma, pulled her into her arms, and whispered words of comfort. But her eyes still flashed with anger and heartache. Liam, after settling the matter, looked at their family with remorseful eyes, as if he was trying to apologize in his presence. As captain and head of flight, he knew that this was a moment of decisive leadership and action to protect the airline's honor and, more importantly, protect its passengers. In the midst of the heavy and tense atmosphere, James, Emma's father, stepped up like a powerful wave tearing through the chaos. His face was full of determination, but his eyes showed a mixture of anger and worry for his daughter. His tall figure shielded himself from Emma, like an unshakable protective shield. "Miss Jenkins," his voice sounded, not loud but powerful, "what right do you think you have to treat my daughter like that? She's just a child." Sarah, who had now stepped back, looked confused and a little out of her composure. Although she tried to keep a tough attitude, her hands trembled a little as she hugged the document tightly. She opened her mouth to respond, but in the face of a father's anger, her words became weak. "I don't mean to offend," she began, but James immediately interrupted, not letting her justify. "No offense? So what is the act of yelling, intimidating, and frightening her to the point of not daring to breathe?" His voice became sharper and sharper, but he didn't lose control. He didn't shout, but every word was emphasized, as if he wanted everyone in the cabin to hear every word clearly. "I don't care if you have a problem with your job, but you are not allowed to vent your anger on an innocent child. This is not how a service worker behaves, and certainly not how you should treat my family." The whole cabin was silent. Sarah's gaze wavered, as if she couldn't find a way to respond. The suffocating atmosphere made her even more nervous. In the end, she just stood still, unable to say a word. Sophia, Emma's mother, looked at her husband with appreciative eyes, but she couldn't hide her anxiety as she watched the tension in the cabin continue to rise. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder, as if to pull him back to his family's side. "James," she said quietly, her voice soft enough for him to hear, "we need to stay calm for Emma." Listening to his wife, James took a deep breath, his eyes still sharp, but his voice lowered. He bent down to level with his daughter, gently placing his hand on her trembling little shoulders. "Emma, are you okay?" he asked, his voice much softer than when he confronted Sarah. She didn't say anything, just nodded and snuggled into her father's chest, looking for safety. James squeezed her tightly in his arms, as if to protect him from all harm. In that moment, all the anger in him seemed to dissipate, replaced by the pain of seeing his daughter suffer so much. James's intervention not only clarifies the anger of a father who protects the family, but also makes the passengers around him feel more deeply about this dilemma. Some nodded in agreement, while others began to speak out in support of his family. They sided with James, forming an informal coalition to protest against the injustice that Emma had suffered. After the tension peaked, the cabin of the plane gradually subsided, but the atmosphere was still smoldering like a fire that had not been completely extinguished. Emma sat still in the chair, her little hands clenched tightly to the blanket that the stewardess had just brought. Her face was still pale, and her eyes occasionally glanced around with anxiety, as if she was afraid that any noise might trigger the nightmare. Beside her, Sophia gently stroked her daughter's hair, her voice whispering like a sweet lullaby, "It's all over, darling. Mom and Dad are here." But in her heart, she still couldn't stop feeling pain when she saw the obvious hurt on her child's face. Her eyes were filled with sadness mixed with self-reproach, as if she was blaming herself for not protecting her better. In the other row, James still did not sit still. His gaze kept rolling around the cabin, like a falcon looking for any sign of danger that might harm his family. The anger in him had subsided, but it left a simmering frustration that he could not let go. He squinted at Sarah, the stewardess who had just caused the incident, who was now standing farther away, trying to keep his distance. Her appearance clearly showed confusion and fear. Sarah didn't dare to look him in the eye, occasionally sneaking a glance at their family with an expression that was a mixture of remorse and self-defense. When a nearby passenger asked softly, "Is she okay?" in a low and sympathetic voice, James nodded, responding succinctly, "Thank you," but he couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders and facial expressions. Every sympathetic word of the other passengers around him, even if well-intentioned, still rubbed salt into the wound, reminding him of the moment of helplessness when his daughter was treated unfairly. In front of the cabin, another flight attendant walked over, apparently Sarah's superior. This person lowered his head, his face clearly showing a look of regret as he spoke to James and Sophia. "We sincerely apologize for this unwanted experience," the hostess said, in a professional but sincere tone. "We will make sure to deal with this issue immediately when the flight lands." Although the apology was given, James just nodded, keeping a cold attitude but not making any more noise. "We just want our daughter to be safe," he said, his voice calm but weighty, as a warning that he wouldn't let this pass easily. For the rest of the flight, James's family tried to calm down, but the feeling of suffocation lingered. Emma slowly relaxed thanks to her mother's reassurance, but still nestled close to Sophia's lap like a little bird looking for shelter. In the distance, Sarah quietly avoided, no longer had her original haughty appearance. She seemed to be deeply considering her actions, her eyes occasionally flashing with regret as she looked at the small family. The whole cabin, although quieter, still carries an indescribable heavy feeling. A few passengers secretly exchanged glances and whispered to each other, as if they had just witnessed an incident that they will remember forever. The flight continues, but the reverberations of the incident are still there, as a lesson in sensitivity and responsibility in how to treat others. When the flight landed and the passengers began to leave the plane, Sarah Jenkins knew that she could no longer shirk her responsibility. Her small figure looked even more stubborn as she stood in front of the entire cabin, her gaze lowered in an effort to find the courage to face what she had done. The whispers of the passengers gradually subsided when they realized that the young flight attendant was about to say something important. Sarah's voice trembled at the beginning, but she tried to stay calm. "First of all, I want to apologize to everyone on the flight for the unfortunate incident, especially to Emma's family." She paused, her eyes glancing at James, Sophia, and Emma, who were sitting close to her mother. "My actions were not right, and I really regret causing stress and hurt to my family." Sarah continued to speak, but it was clear that her apology was more than just a procedure. Guilt and regret were evident on her face, and every word seemed to be carefully considered. "I didn't handle the situation as professionally and sensitively as I should. I take responsibility and commit to learning from this mistake." As Sarah spoke, the passengers' eyes were focused on her, some showing sympathy, others keeping a judgmental attitude. In his seat, James remained silent, but his expression was cold, his eyes sharp as if he wanted to assess whether the apology was sincere enough. Sophia, on the other hand, nodded slightly as a small gesture in response to the stewardess's repentance, while her hand still gently gripped Emma's little hand, reassuring her. Emma, though confused, seemed to be attracted to the apology. She turned to look at her mother with a probing look, as if to ask if she should forgive the hostess. Sophia smiled slightly, her gentle eyes telling her daughter that everyone can make mistakes, but the important thing is to know how to correct them. After the apology, Sarah bowed her head very low, as if to send one last signal of her sincerity. The atmosphere in the cabin calmed down a little, but the past event was still hovering in everyone's minds. When she lifted her head, her eyes met James's, and she seemed to be waiting for a response. James nodded slightly, not saying anything, but the move was enough to show that he had acknowledged his apology. As the passengers began to leave, a few stopped, patted Sarah on the shoulder or offered words of encouragement. "You did the right thing when you took the blame," but others glanced at it with a cold look, suggesting that trust is not easily restored. Sarah stood silent for a moment after they all left the plane, breathing out as if she had lifted some of her burden. But her eyes showed that what happened today would forever be a big lesson in her career and life. After the chaos on the flight subsides, the family of James, Sophia, and Emma finally have some time to calm down. Sitting in the airport lounge, James's eyes were still tense, but his voice was warm as he turned to reassure his wife. "We're over, it's going to be fine." His words were not only for Sophia, but also as a reminder to himself that their family was strong enough to overcome any challenge. Sophia nodded, her eyes shining with determination. In the previous chaotic moment, she clearly felt her responsibility, not only to her daughter but also to the whole family. She gently stroked Emma's hair, placed a kiss on her forehead and whispered, "You're good, Emma. I'm very proud of you." Her words carried unconditional love, helping her to feel safe and loved. Emma, still a little confused by what had happened, looked at her mother with big round eyes. She didn't say anything, but her little arms wrapped around her mother as if looking for protection. The incident was a shock to a child like Emma, but thanks to the comfort and love from her parents, she gradually felt better. Meanwhile, James not only comforts his wife and children, but also tries to keep his spirits up to face the curious gazes from around. He has always believed that the most important thing is to protect his family, and this incident further strengthens that belief. His eyes softened when he saw his wife and daughter smiling slightly, as a reminder that their family was stronger than any challenge. When sitting next to each other, the three seemed to form a small circle full of warmth and love in the chaotic space of the airport. They didn't say much, but the light touches, encouraging eyes, and understanding silence were enough to soothe any hurt. For James and Sophia, they realized that, no matter what happens, the most important thing is that the family is always together. As for Emma, although she is small, she gradually feels the power of family love, a sense of security that nothing can replace. Immediately after the incident occurred, representatives of the airline began to be present to handle the situation. Sarah Jenkins, an experienced customer manager for the company, walked up to James' family with a serious but not caring expression. She knew that this situation was not simply an ordinary incident. This is an incident that can seriously affect the reputation of the company. While observing the scene in front of her, Sarah's mind is constantly calculating the next steps. She needs to handle the case delicately but also quickly and efficiently. She looked at James, the father who looked tired but patient, and approached gently, very polite. "We are very sorry for what happened, Mr. James. We are investigating the incident and will take appropriate measures to ensure the comfort of his family," she said in a calm but clear tone. However, Sarah couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Sophia, James's wife, had not fully calmed down, and she looked at Sarah with suspicious eyes, feeling as if the matter had not been properly handled. She didn't seem to fully trust Sarah's promise. "We've been through a big shock, and this isn't the first time we've been in a situation like this," Sophia said, her voice hard, unforgiving. Sarah recognized the anger and frustration in Sophia's words, and while she maintained her professional appearance, she couldn't help but feel nervous. She knew that her apologies and commitments had not been able to ease the family's discomfort. Sarah raised her hand gently and reassured Sophia, "We will make sure everything is settled. On the airline side, we take the safety and comfort of our passengers very seriously. We will provide all information and support to his family as soon as possible." Although her words were somewhat reassuring, Sarah couldn't help but notice a clear distrust on the part of James' family. This made her wonder, and she promised to make clearer progress in resolving the matter. From the bottom of her heart, Sarah understands that her airline is facing an image crisis that they cannot take lightly. Seeing Sarah's anxious attitude, James decided not to linger for long, knowing full well that he and his family needed time to recover from these stresses. "Thank you for being there to assist, but we will need more time to process. Hopefully we can do whatever it takes to make us feel safe and respected," James said, his eyes resolute but also gentle. Sarah nodded in agreement, secretly feeling lucky to be able to handle this situation without any further incidents. However, she knows that this is only the first step, and that there is still a lot of work to be done to regain the trust of James' family and the public in her airline. After the stressful incident on the flight, when things calmed down, James and his family finally settled down in a quieter space. James, the father of the family, sat silently on a chair in the hotel room the airline had provided, his hands clasped, his mind still spinning. He felt tired, but not because of the long flight or the noise of the crowd, but because of the surge of emotions that he could not completely control. In silence, James thought about what had happened, how Sarah Jenkins' thoughtless actions and the explosion on the plane had disrupted his family's life. He couldn't forget the terrified look in his daughter, Emma, when she felt threatened by the unacceptable behavior of the other passenger. His heart was heavy at the thought of the worry of his wife, Sophia, who had not yet been able to regain his composure after the incident. Sophia, sitting next to him, reached out and patted him as if to give him some comfort. She didn't say anything, but in her eyes, there was a clear consistency. After all, they are still a family, and it is important now that they maintain that bond. The feeling of helplessness in her heart could not be hidden, but Sophia understood that now was the time for them to calm their anger and focus on keeping the family at peace. "We're going to get through this," she whispered, her voice calm but determined. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins, a representative of the airline, although she is not directly with James' family at this time, in her mind, everything is still not over. She sits at her desk in the office, apology letters, internal calls and announcements keep coming. A heavy sense of responsibility rested on her shoulders, because she understood that the incident was not just a minor incident, but could have long-term consequences for the airline. Sarah did her best to keep the situation out of control, but she knew that the company needed to do something bigger to prove it cared about passengers. She began drafting an internal announcement to request increased training for employees on how to handle emergencies and take care of customers. In Sarah's heart, she hopes that she can do more to restore trust on the part of the passengers, but she also realizes that an apology alone will not be enough. The next day, James and his family received a call from Sarah. She apologized again and promised to support them with everything necessary. However, despite the gentle words, and even though Sarah's attitude was more sincere, James felt that neither he nor his family could fully return to the way they were. The emotional wounds were still there, and he understood that they would need time to heal. However, James also knows that this is only a small part of his journey and that of his family, and while he cannot change what has happened, he can still take control of his future by continuing to protect his family and learn to forgive. Ultimately, in James's mind, life is not just about moments of peace, but about the ability to overcome challenges, learn from mistakes, and strengthen relationships. He held his wife's hand, a gentle but powerful gesture, as if to remind himself that family is always the strongest thing he can cling to in difficult times.